In this news roundup for the week on Friday 26th of April 2024, the Scottish Government coalition collapses over recent changes in net zero policies, and the SNP minority administration could be forced to call a new election. Germany has been rocked by allegations that high-placed Green Party members in the coalition government lied and falsified documents in order to advance a phase-out of nuclear power, and Google calls timeout on the phenomenon of activist employees by sacking those who held a sit-in in its offices and declaring that the workplace is where you come to do business, not politics. Now, last week I mentioned that Scotland had abandoned ambitious interim climate targets as reality caught up with them, since they hadn't taken many steps that were remotely in line with actually achieving them. The Scottish Government has, to date, of course, been a coalition government between the Scottish Nationalist Party and the Greens. What would the junior coalition party make of this sudden about-face? Well, the unsurprising answer is that it took a rather dim view of it and was due to hold a vote next month on whether to stick with the coalition deal in the light of it. Presumably, seeing which way that particular process was going to end up, the Scottish First Minister Humza Yousaf figured that it was better to proactively cut the cord first rather than wait to get dumped. And so it was this week that the SNP declared that they were ending the coalition agreement and they would be governing instead as a minority government. It may have been the straw that broke the camel's back, but it was only the latest cause of tension within that particular alliance. Greens had been very much against the SNP's recent freeze on council tax rates, and the pause brought in on the prescription of puberty blockers for children in the Scottish NHS in the wake of the CAS review. That was also opposed by Greens. So what's the first thing a newly emerged minority government can expect? Yeah, you guessed it, an early vote of no confidence to test whether the Greens are minded to back the SNP informally or whether they're annoyed enough to vote to bring the whole thing crashing down. Now, at the time of recording this video, there were motions of no confidence in the First Minister by the Tories, which would see Humza Yousaf under pressure to resign, but the rest of the government to retain intact, and a motion of no confidence in the government itself by Labour, which, if passed, would result in elections. The Greens have indicated they will vote against Humza Yousaf on the first motion, but not yet, and this may have changed by the time you see this video, whether they would vote against the actual government in the second. The Greens, while part of the coalition, had urged the government to go faster and further on net zero policies, particularly on the rollout of electric heat pumps to replace gas boilers, a policy which has been very contentious in the UK context generally. So it hasn't happened yet. But it could be an example of a government that falls specifically over climate policy. Take from that whatever lessons you choose. Speaking of Greens pushing government policies, a breaking story in Germany, the details which will no doubt continue to develop over the next few weeks, suggests that German Greens in the coalition government lied in order to push through the phase-out of nuclear power there. As you may recall, with the energy crisis caused by the Ukraine war, as supplies of Russian gas to Europe were interrupted and reduced, it was the odd backdrop to the German insistence in closing down what was at that point its cheapest and most reliable form of energy, nuclear power. There had been discussions about whether the life of the nuclear plants, which were scheduled to be shut down, it was the end of their life theoretically, whether that could be extended to cover this period of energy crisis. And the answer came that this had been looked at, but for safety reasons, it wasn't possible. To prolong them would be actually rather dangerous. Now, it's not as though nobody thought that was odd at the time, but nevertheless, to great Green Party joy, the German Greens cemented their identity back in the 1980s as being, above anything else, anti-nuclear power. The plants were eventually shut down, albeit slightly later than they wished. The result of that, of course, was the reopening of coal operations and an increase in German CO2 emissions. and more expensive energy for businesses and consumers. Now it seems that top-ranking Greens in the Ministry of Economic Affairs intentionally falsified expert reports to make it look like nuclear power was no longer viable. This is according to Cicero magazine, which gained access to internal documents via a Freedom of Information request that had to be contested in the courts before it was finally granted. According to Cicero, citing internal documents and emails, Greens in high positions of power diverted reports out of sight or even altered them if they ran counter to their preferred outcomes. And the report named Patrick Gratian and Stefan Tidau, then undersecretaries at the Economy and Environment Ministries, as having conspired to ensure that their ministers didn't get any information that they hadn't approved. So in March 2022, the ministers should have received advice saying that an extension of nuclear power plants' life could have helped the situation in Germany's energy sector and kept prices lower during the coming winter. That document was rewritten to say instead that any extension of the nuclear power plant's operations, quote, is not tenable on technical/security grounds. While Chancellor Olaf Scholz ordered the plants to remain operational through the winter anyway, despite those supposed warnings, the accelerated push to phase out nuclear continued as a point of urgency and was finally achieved in 2023. The Ministry of Economic Affairs has rejected the claims made by Cicero, saying that its information was, quote, shortened and without context, leading them to conclusions that were not accurate. Opposition party CDU demanded immediate clarification, saying, the old suspicion is confirmed. Parliament and the population were lied to when nuclear power was phased out. Deputy FDP leader Wolfgang Kubicki said that the allegations were serious, but urged caution, saying that a single media story wasn't enough to jump to conclusions. If documents had really been falsified, this would indeed raise serious doubts about the integrity of state institutions, he said. But he feared that, quote, we are pouring an incredible amount of grist onto the mill of conspiracy theorists and the AfD. Well, maybe so, but if there is a scandal within government, any attempt to downplay or excuse it, historically that's what feeds conspiracy theorists and critics the most. So maybe it's just time to fess up and be straightforward and transparent about everything. And that's a process you could probably apply as well to this next story. During this period where it seems that every week there are big announcements from the giant tech companies, Google, OpenAI, Apple, Microsoft and all the rest, about the latest artificial intelligence breakthrough that they're about to launch onto the market, one other very interesting announcement this week got somewhat less attention. I mean, it got some attention, but arguably a lot less than it merited. Because one of the other factors of life with the big tech companies has been the rise of the activist employee, the ones who became increasingly restless about the ethics of every decision that their bosses ever make, the ones who would start a Twitter storm against such figures, not relenting until their targets had been fired, the ones who would protest their company's contracts with the US defense establishment, for example, and push until those companies backed away from those contracts. We've seen a couple of tech CEOs seek to break the trend. So, for example, 3 years ago, Jason Fried of what was then called Basecamp, who back in 2021 announced that the workplace was for work, and it was banning societal and political discussions. A huge outcry followed. Employees complained that they were being inhibited from discussing their company's alleged failings with regard to things like diversity, equity and inclusion. After hearing it for a month or so, Fried and his co-founder shut the discussions down. All of the talk in the columns and the social media at the time was that this was a huge misstep by the company, and that the evidence for this was that around a third of the staff had announced that they were quitting. Before Basecamp, the one that first stuck its head above the parapet was Coinbase CEO Brian Armstrong, which similarly banned political discussion in the workplace. Similarly controversial and stormy, But they didn't back down. They let people leave if they wanted to leave. They recruited people who were happy to work in their stead. And they carried on making products, carried on growing as successful companies. That was then. But of course, in the meantime, everyone else was carrying on as before, which generally means giving way when such storms fell upon them. Until this week. This week, Google had been faced by a number of its own employees conducting a sit-in in its offices in New York and California. The topic of the protest was not what Google was doing specifically, it was Israel and Gaza. But it was focused on the fact that Google has a commercial relationship with the Israeli government. The protest was styled "No Tech for Apartheid." In this case, the company had the protesters ejected from their premises, and they simply fired everyone who had been involved, around 50 people according to recent reports. Soon in the wake of that, before the dust had even settled, Google CEO Sundar Pichai sent a company-wide memo to all employees saying that the policy was now to keep politics out of the workplace. "This is a business," he said, "and not a place to act in a way that disrupts co-workers or to fight over disruptive issues or debate politics." Now, this could turn out to be the moment when the big, historically liberal-leaning corporations of the US decide to no longer submit to the activist employee playbook. Previously, it used to be held that cancel culture was so rampant that any boss trying to stand up to such pressure would inevitably be signing the death warrant of their own career. But with a company that had been such a trailblazer for the cause as Google, calling that enough is enough, you'd think that a number of others will happily march smartly in behind them, feeling that this is the moment to establish new working norms, or more accurately, to restore some old ones. Maybe it's too early to make that call. No doubt that memo by Pichai is a significant one, the success or failure of which will reverberate through parts of corporate America for the next few years. Alright, my thanks as always to the people who support this channel on Patreon. As you know, I could not do these videos without their support. If you would like to add yours, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. See you next time.